Or good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have many of you on. It's great to have all of you on this webinar. My name is Gustavo Payan. I work for Development Alternatives Incorporated. I'm based in Honduras, and I am the co-chair of the Advocacy Working Group in INEE, the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies. I will be moderating today's webinar on using human rights in advocating for better education in emergencies. And we have an amazing lineup of presenters. I'll introduce them briefly, but I want to let you know as well that we will hear from them. Each one of them will speak for a few minutes. We'll have one or a few slides from each one of them. Then we will allow time for questions and answers and any other comments. Your questions or comments can be posted on the chat box at the lower right hand corner. So if you don't see the chat box, you can enable it by clicking on the conversation or the bubble item or icon and the main screen, or you can raise your hand if you know how to do that with your name on the participant list. You can raise your hand. We'll try to make sure to be paying attention to everybody who's raising their hand, and then asking people to if you have your question ready. One is fine. Just make sure that you also use your
Looks like either February right now.
Can you mute your microphone?
Not one that everyone can make. Jenny is only available February 21.
Or host.
Yeah, Rita is available 21st also. She said it would be by conference call.
Edmund, can you help me muting some microphones?
Like 26 or 28.
I'm just trying to mute them.
Okay, so let's make sure that we all mute our microphones for that exact reason. Or host, or because INEE and behind the technologies, Edmund Page from the Advocacy Working Group, he has the right to mute people's microphone if that is interfering with the conversation. So don't be offended if we do that. You can unmute it if you have a question you're given the floor. So without further ado, I will introduce our presenters. We will start with Peter Hill-Larsen. He's the advocacy coordinator of the Advocacy Working Group of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, of which Edmund and I are a part of, or members. We have Diya Niyawin, who's the director of the Global Coalition on Protecting Education from Attack. We have Sylvain Aubry, who's a legal and research advisor for the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We have Delphine Dorsey, executive coordinator of the Right to Education Initiative. We have a very interesting set of presentations. They'll complement each other very well. We'll start with Peter, who will give sort of an overview of advocacy in the context of education emergencies, why we do it, and a little of the legal framework. We'll go to Diya, who will be talking about advocacy on protecting education from attack through a safe school declaration. Then Sylvain will talk about using human rights approaches to address privatization in context of education emergencies. And last but not least, Delphine will talk about working with journalists and the use of audiovisual material through a human rights lens. So very interesting presentation. Thank you everybody for joining. I'll start actually just with a couple of slides to let people know who is organizing this, in case you're not familiar with the Advocacy Working Group. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies, INEE. We assume that all of you are familiar. If you are joining us is because you're likely familiar with INEE. But the Advocacy Working Group was formed in 2012 along with the two other working groups in INEE, the Standards and Practice and Education Policy. We together amplify and promote and advocate for education emergencies globally. We support INEE strategic. The first strategic objective of INEE, which is to serve as a global advocate and thought leader promoting education for all in all circumstances. So this is important to say because this is the reason why we have this series of webinars. This is the second in a series of webinars of the current advocacy working group. So I won't read for you the objectives. You can read those on your screen. And if you have any questions about the advocacy working group, please feel free to contact me as a co-chair or contact Peter Hill Larson as well. Next slide. Just a little bit, just the last slide on the advocacy working group. My other co-chair is Ellen from CARE USA. But we have members from the Global Campaign for Education, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, the Global Education Cluster, IRC, Plan International, Protect Education and Security and Conflict, the Right to Education Initiatives, Save the Children and Xavier Project. You can see that some of our members are actually presenting in today's webinar. We have a set of priorities for the advocacy working group. For the next couple of years. First and foremost is promoting the INEE minimum standards, but also supporting advocacy, capacity development in advocacy, which is one of the reasons why we have this webinar. Elevating voices, making sure that all the voices from the field and everywhere are heard, and ensuring and promoting child protection. So I'll stop there with the overview about the INEE Advocacy Working Group, and I'm going to ask Peter, who's the actual INEE Advocacy Working Group coordinator, to start his presentation on for today's webinar. Peter?
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Gustavo, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, I muted my phone.
Good.
Yes, but we can hear you.
Great. Okay, I'll get started. I just want one slide here on what advocacy is. I just put on up three different definitions. They're closely aligned, all of them. It's just to say that there seems to be a common understanding that it is a very deliberate process. It's about influencing decision makers, changing policies, changing resource allocations, legislation, as we'll be talking about today also, and it's for the direct objective to reduce poverty, to achieve changes for children's lives in the case of education emergencies, and also to press governments so that they will respect, protect, and fulfill children's rights. That aspect will, of course, be coming back to strongly today. But it's just to show three definitions here of what advocacy is, just to start us off on a fairly common or the same platform. Next slide, please. So why do we do education and emergency advocacy? We do it for the same reason we do education and development advocacy any other. You know, it's to increase the reach and sustainability of the impact, of course, changing policies and practices. It's to hold duty bearers accountable, especially since they've signed up to fulfill rights bearers' rights. That's what we're going to talk about today. It's to ensure that education is prioritized within the humanitarian response. That was not always so, but over the last couple of years, 10 years, the education emergency sector has probably won that argument that education is a life-saving and life-sustaining intervention, and therefore needs to be there in a humanitarian response. And then, of course, it is, as Gustavo was pointing to ensure that the voices of those who are affected are elevated. So that's another reason for advocacy. Let me now turn to human rights. Next slide. So I just put a very quick here, a couple of headings on the different regimes within international legal framework. We have the human rights law, which is applicable in all contexts. People don't lose their human rights just because they are caught in conflict or famine or natural disasters. So that's very important to keep in mind. So that's overall chapeau. Underneath that, we have some more kind of lex specialis, and one of them is the international humanitarian law, which is applicable in conflict. It's based on Geneva Conventions, on the Hague Conventions, on various protocols and treaties. Again, these two, as well as the next one, international refugee law, the refugee law is a protection of forcibly displaced persons owing to a well-founded fear of persecution. So that means people who have crossed an international border and therefore can rely on the protection of the international community or the receiving country. Those who have not crossed an international border, they still rely on the protection of the state where they are, and they are internally displaced persons, but there are guidelines as well for helping them. Lastly, there's the international criminal law. That deals with individuals as opposed to the other regimes. This one is interesting because here you can actually hold an individual president or an individual army commander or such accountable. Let me just illustrate it with the next slide here. Right, so here you have, we still live in a kind of a Westphalian order where the nation state is the most important. So the 193 countries of the UN, but of course they are regulated. Or are they? Oh, can I ask someone to good. Sorry, I was just interfering. So that the nation states, of course, have deposited some of their sovereignty at an international level, both through regional conventions. We have the systems in Africa, in the Americas, in Europe, and through the international system around the international human rights law. And again, here I put the international human rights law as a big bubble, and then there's an overlap with the humanitarian law, criminal law, as well as the refugee law. Underneath, we also have the UN Charter and Security Council, and their resolutions, they have also sometimes a different binding effect. What you will see here is that I've highlighted the CRC, which is a Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's very interesting, as you will see here on the next slide. If Edmund, you can get the next slide. There, I just highlight the Convention on the Rights of the Child from 1989 because it's an interesting one that straddles humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law. You have Article 2, which is on discrimination in general. Often it's a good entry point for litigation on education emergencies or any education rights. It's not through the education articles, which are Article 28 and 29, but Article 2, which is around discrimination. Then you've got Article 22, which is refugee rights, children's rights as refugee. And then you've got Article 38, which is around children caught in conflict, child soldiers, and other things. So actually, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a very interesting all-purpose convention. I've listed some of the other conventions here and their relevant articles. You've got the Refugee Convention from 1951. It's a little outdated. It only talks about elementary education, where some of the later ones are much better at talking about primary education, secondary education, tertiary education, etc. You will also see that I mentioned, lastly, the Safe Schools Declaration. DIA will come back to this one. It is not a binding instrument. It's not a binding human rights law, international humanitarian law, but DIA will explain more what that is. Next slide. Just an example of using the United Nations system. Some of you will be familiar with it. I think Sylvain will come back to it in a little while, referring to it. But in the United Nations system, there are these treaty bodies, treaty-based mechanisms. These are committees set up for each of the treaties. And national governments, when they ratify a treaty, they have to report to these committees on their compliance with their obligations. They are then examined in Geneva, and the treaty bodies then issue concluding comments or observations based on information from the states, from NGOs, from individuals in certain cases, and from the UN itself. And all this, on the basis of that examination, and all that is available in the public sphere. And I encourage you to go and look at it at the OHCHR's website. And this reporting period and this process is often a very good tool for advocacy. NGOs can submit alternative reports, shadow reports they're called, elaborating on the information that's contained in state party reports and provide alternative analysis. That's often very important to have an alternative voice. And often it's national civil society coalitions who come around and create these shadow reports, perhaps aided by pro bono legal aid to navigate the legal route. So that's just my last slide here. Yeah, just to hammer through what it is the key obligations of the state are with regards to education. To respect, that means refrain from interfering with the enjoyment of education. To protect means guarantee that no third party is interfering. Sylvain will be talking about this to a certain extent. And then to fulfill, to take appropriate legislative, administrative, budgetary, etc., to fulfill the right to education. So those are the key obligations. And I'll stop here and pass it on to Dia.
Thank you, Peter. This is a very important framework to get us started. You mentioned the Safe School Declaration briefly, and we have now Dia, the young one, who will be speaking a little more about that. So Dia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to share with you some testimony from Fatima, a student at the College of Business and Management Studies in Konduga, Nigeria, when it was attacked on March 11, 2014. Boko Haram was shooting. Then they started using petrol to set the school dormitories on fire. There was a lot of crying and screaming. I was wearing trousers and another girl was also wearing pants. One of the insurgents says, "Are you a man? You have to go." Two of the fighters started chasing me around with a gun like they were going to shoot. I ran into one of the buildings to hide. I went in before I realized that they had already set fire there. So I had to run back out. Suddenly I felt terrible pain in my stomach and on my skin. I had serious burns all over my body from having run into the burning dormitory. International human rights law guarantees everyone the right to education. Nonetheless, GCP's research, that's the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, has identified that 12,700 targeted or indiscriminate attacks on education have taken place from 2013 through 2017. And these attacks have harmed over 21,000 teachers, academics, and students like Fatima. If you could change the slide, please. This is a picture of some of the girls in Nigeria. It doesn't include Fatima, but some other girls who were kidnapped from their school just recently in February last year. So not only are many governments not fulfilling their obligations under international human rights law to realize the right to education, but they're also violating commitments under international human rights law that guarantee students, teachers, academics, and all education staff the right to life, personal liberty and security, and that require states to ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of children. So in seeking to better protect education in armed conflict, GCPA doesn't just focus on the right to education, but also violations of these other human rights. And as the issue of attacks on education occur in the context of armed conflict, GCPA also has to consider the obligations of international humanitarian law and how that intersects with human rights law. So our advocacy hasn't just focused on education actors, but it's also included protection actors and in particular armed forces, including peacekeeping forces and non-state armed groups. The Safe Schools Declaration has been an important tool that GCP has been using to do this, and it provides some insight on different advocacy strategies. If you could change the slide, please. These are just some photos. The slides are really just a few photos of some of these incidences of attack. So to start, I'll discuss advocacy leading to the development of the Safe Schools Declaration, and then advocacy also on how to get states to endorse and implement the declaration. So if someone could mute their line. early in GCP's development, it identified an issue, we identified an issue that had received very little attention up to then, which was the use of schools and universities for military purposes as barracks and bases, weapons store, and even torture centers by armed forces and non-state armed groups. So the first thing we did really to advocate on this issue was to conduct research to better understand the problem and to be able to document it. And we found that in the majority of countries in conflict, schools and universities have been used for military purposes, which made them into a target of attack by opposing forces and put the lives of students and teachers within them at risk. This, of course, caused psychological fear that led to teachers and students dropping out and the quality of education deteriorating considerably. Sometimes the armed forces and armed groups took over the school entirely, which really closed it off for educational purposes and denied access to education for tens of thousands of students. So armed with this documentation of the extent and the impact of military use, GCP contracted with a former UK military commander and law professor to draft a set of draft guidelines for protecting schools from military use. We recognized that if we were going to be able to convince anyone to be able to do something about this issue of military use, we had to get someone who was very familiar with how militaries worked and how they functioned, but also who would be convincing to the target, which would be these military actors. At the same time, we needed to make sure that governments and the other agencies, UN agencies, felt like they were really buying into this process of developing guidelines, and so we had a series of workshops and meetings where they were invited to comment on the draft, and they were revised based on their input. And then finally, it was really important to ensure that this wasn't just seen as an NGO-led initiative, but that it was something that the governments themselves had developed. And so we needed to find a state champion that would be willing to lead the process of finalizing the guidelines and then encouraging states to endorse them. And fortunately, Norway and Argentina were willing to take on that role and lend their expertise in this process. So one of the main challenges was, well, how do you get states to sign on to a set of guidelines? Like, how do you make it into some sort of an instrument when they're just a set of guidelines? How do you get them to endorse it? So Norway suggested that we create a declaration, or that they create a declaration that would not just include states committing to sign on to the guidelines and use them, put them into practice, but that this declaration would also include a whole other range of protections for education in armed conflict. So this initiative really went sort of beyond what we had hoped for, which was sort of a real focus on just military use, and expanded out to include the whole range of types of measures that can better protect education in armed conflict. And as a result, it's become a very important tool in the way we do our advocacy as well. So the next step, of course, was then, once we've got this tool for protecting education from attack, how do we get countries to sign on to it and to start implementing it? So this started off with a conference by Norway, hosted a conference in 2015. Of course, there was a lot of advocacy leading up to the conference, encouraging states to attend, and this was a venue where states could announce their commitment to endorse and implement the Safe Schools Declaration. And at that point, 37 countries signed on, and 4 years later, or less than 4 years later, we have 82 countries. So that's more than doubled the initial number of endorsing states. So how have we gone about trying to, and not us, when I say us, I mean the wide partnership, states, different NGOs, and the organizations that are within our own coalition. It's been a very collaborative process with a wide range of actors involved. But what are some of the strategies that we've used? And if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide that has the countries that have endorsed, please. So first, it's involved really supporting peer-to-peer advocacy, encouraging and supporting endorsing states to advocate with other states to join and implement the declaration. Again, it's much more convincing if another state asks a government to endorse and tells them why it's important they do so, rather than an NGO or civil society doing it. They have they're more convinced by their peers. We've also worked with civil society and international organizations within the country that we're hoping will endorse the declaration. So the fact that they're based locally means that they can engage in a much more sustained effort with their government to encourage them to endorse the declaration. And there's some more legitimacy there, as it's the citizens who voted for their government demanding that they follow this course of action. Another important component has been documenting attacks on education, mainly through our global study, Education Under Attack. And we found that it's really critical to have current data to be able to show during our advocacy visits, look, this is still happening in this place and this is the impact that's occurring. Not 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even 2 years ago, but right now, this is something that's current. And then disseminating the research also is a whole other component. And one way we've done that, our partners have disseminated the country profiles to these treaty monitoring bodies that Peter was talking about. And when the CRC, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, for example, is examining a state, we've recommended to them that they highlight what's in the profile and also encourage them to endorse the declaration, and if they've already endorsed, to talk about what they've done to implement it. And this has actually been quite a successful strategy, and several countries have reported on it and been asked by the committee what they've been doing. And in fact, it's gone beyond the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The committee on the CEDAW Committee on Discrimination Against Women has also been doing this. Another component has been highlighting the issue of attacks on education and the declaration itself at high-level international fora, such as the World Humanitarian Summit and the annual Security Council debates on children in armed conflict, and at the Human Rights Council every year as well. So it's really important that this issue of attacks on education and the declaration itself remains visible and relevant and is constantly being brought up as relevant to different contexts, so that we don't lose momentum in terms of endorsement and implementation. In addition to that, we've been supporting international conferences every 2 years that focus on the Safe Schools Declaration. So the first one, of course, was in Oslo in 2015. That was followed by a conference in Buenos Aires in 2017. And the next one is coming up in Spain in May of this year. And the idea, again, is to really galvanize attention and focus on the declaration and provide an opportunity for new states to endorse, but also for the states that have already endorsed to have a forum or platform world stage where they can announce what they've been doing to implement the declaration. So it puts a bit of pressure on them to show us what they've been doing. Another point is that at the Security Council debates every year on children in armed conflict, states make statements on what they want to see happen and what they've done, etc. So they really value being briefed ahead of time on the issue of attacks on education and having sort of advocacy points they can include in their statements. So these are, again, opportune times where they're much more open to listening to our advocacy and to putting it into effect. So before these types of meetings, we have bilateral meetings with missions to the UN in Geneva and New York, and also visits to Capitol to explain how they can better implement the declaration. And finally, an important part of our strategy has been documenting and sharing good practice that occurs anywhere in the world, really, in terms of implementing the commitments in the declaration. The idea behind this is that many states are very wary of signing on to something, saying, well, once we've signed on, how do we put it into practice? So we're able to show them, look, this other country that's in a very similar situation to you, that's also maybe doesn't have a lot of financial clout, has just come out of war, they've been able to implement these types of measures. This is something you might be able to do as well. And we've held some international, regional, and also some national level workshops where we've really worked very closely with the Ministries of Education, Defense, and Foreign Affairs within the domestic context to encourage them to implement and first endorse and then implement the declaration. So those really are the strategies that we've been using, and sort of to highlight the maybe three main takeaways is that research has to accompany that advocacy. We need to have data that can be used in the advocacy, otherwise it's very hard to make the argument we're trying to make. Also, the advocacy always requires some sort of a hook. It's much more effective when there's an event that states can make their announcement at, so that they get a lot of accolades and attention to the good work that they're doing. And this, of course, then creates publicity for what they've done, and that then encourages other states to endorse. So it's really important to identify hooks for the advocacy and always identify the next hook. And finally, the sharing of good practice we found has been really critical as well to show that the declaration is having an impact, so that it remains legitimate, and to show states what they can be doing to better implement the declaration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dia, for a very interesting presentation, the powerful testimonial. Just a quick plug in for the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. They released their annual report, not annual, the report last year in 2018. Very interesting data, very interesting case studies if you haven't read it. I'm going to move along now and ask Sylvain to share his presentation with us. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that most people have connected their audio. Again, if you cannot speak, you're probably having issues with your audio. You have to go on the top bar. So thank you, Dia. Sylvain, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? I assume that you can. Hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you, Sylvain.
Okay. Right. So I work for the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a small human rights organization. I'm myself normally based in Nairobi. I'm currently in Paris. And we look at all sorts of economic and social rights issues, including the right to education, where we focus on the role of private actors in education.
Sorry to interrupt, this is Gustavo here. Just I see a few comments from participants. If you can either speak up or get closer to the microphone. I think some people are hearing you a little too far.
Okay, wait.
Probably just.
Is it better now?
That's much better. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, the automatic.
Yeah. Great.
As I say, I work for a small human rights organization. We work on right to education, specifically on the role of private actors. And I want to share in 5 minutes or 7 minutes, so I'll have to make a lot of shortcuts, a couple of tools or examples we've used to implement the right to education in emergency context. The first one is how we've used UN human rights mechanism that Peter alluded to, and the second one is a set of guiding principles we are developing, and which kind of mirrors a little bit the Safe School Declaration, so it's also different. So in both cases, I will give a short example of a country where we used it, and then try to reflect about what it can mean more generally. So on the next slide, starting with UN human rights mechanism and taking the example of Haiti. So first of all, maybe a little introduction on the role of private actors in education. As you know, there's a lot of debate and controversies around privatization of education and whether it's beneficial or not. And us, as a human rights organization, we take a fairly, on paper, simple position, which is human rights actors can exist in education because this is what human rights law offers, but within a set of rules and parameters, and so there are limitations to it. Now the challenge is how does it work in emergency context where the state is often weak and may not be able to deliver itself education directly at the high enough level in the short term. And so that brings another layer of complexity. So taking the example of Haiti, as you might know, there's about 80% of the school, 80 to 90% of the schools in Haiti that are private, and has been like that for 20 to 30 years. As you can see on the graph, in red is the share of private school in the system. Since 72, basically, there's a very, very high share of private education. And the situation has gotten worse with a series of crises Haiti has had to face in the last 15, 20 years, including lately the earthquake. So what we did is, as Peter explained, we researched situation, gathered data. And when I say we, it's actually a combination, in this case of Haiti, of local partners, a human rights clinic in Paris, at Sciences Po in Paris. So I don't know if you know about clinics, but they are groups of students, usually in law faculties, that help specific projects of different organizations. And ourselves, we worked on putting together a parallel report. So Haiti was about to be reviewed by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which reviews whether Haiti is meeting the standards under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the Haitian government submits a report, and we submit another report. So we did so, and on the next slide. Yes. So we submitted an alternative report. We went through a whole process before the UN. I won't go into detail now. But the point is, there's two good things we got out of it. Is A, you get concluding observations, something that was mentioned for the Safe School Declaration, for instance, where the Committee on the Rights of the Child, that is based in Geneva, based on arguments we brought before them, made some recommendation to Haiti regarding, in this case, it's private education, but actually there's a whole range of issues they could comment on. So it applies way beyond privatization of education. It can apply to anything in the rights of education. This is what the concluding observations look like for Haiti. So we got some very, for the UN, some relatively precise recommendation regarding how they should better regulate private education and review some of the programs they had in place. Also, throughout the research and throughout this work, we did engage with the government, the authorities. We told them we would submit a report. So the process itself is a good excuse, a good framework to engage with the authorities in a fairly constructive manner based on existing obligations they have. So that one output is this, and then we're working on this. We're using then this output to strengthen the advocacy of partners in Haiti. They can go to the government and say, it's not only us who ask you to better regulate private schools, for instance, but also, the UN body that is fairly legitimate. And on top of that, and there's another interesting side to the work on Haiti, next slide, is that we also use this to question the role of donors in Haiti. So for those who know Haiti, donors play a very, very big role there, probably way more powerful than the government. And we've had questions about how different donors have been supporting private education to the detriment of public education. So it's a bit of a long story, but to make it short, basically at the end of the day, we questioned what France did, and we managed to get, and we went through a similar process, parallel reporting before UN bodies, where we questioned France's support to, or France's action through the GP actually in Haiti. Got a UN human rights body to make a recommendation saying France should pay attention to what it does in this context. And the result of it has been that France has put together a new policy, education policy in 2017, where they commit to support better regulation of private education. Again, I'm doing lots of shortcut here, but through the work on Haiti, we also managed to question the donor using the UN human rights mechanism. We've used also a number of traditional advocacy strategies, all the things you know, but again, using the human rights language and the human rights bodies and frameworks has helped to frame it and make it maybe open kind of constructive dialogue with the state. So that's one tool. The other tool I want to mention, and that's next slide again. Yes, is how we are developing or finalizing right now the development of a set of standards, so human rights, that we call human rights guiding principles on the role of private actors in education, that try to help us define better what human rights standards are regarding the role of private actors in education. So it's not that easy because the right to education both recognize the obligation of the state to provide education, but also recognize the liberty of parents to choose a school other than the public school. The question, what do we do when, the school that parents want to go to compete with the public education, or what do we do when the state is unable to provide public education and for instance, may want to use a PPP? And that's the case of Liberia. I don't know how much you will know, but 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, the Liberian government all of a sudden decided they would hand over all its public schools to a private management company. Initially, they wanted to hand over all of them to Bridge International Academies, and eventually they decided to go through different providers. The question is this PPP, so essentially it's a public-private partnership, PPP, is this PPP acceptable or not? Knowing the context in Liberia, where the government is very weak, post-Ebola, post-war, can we think maybe in this context a PPP would be acceptable because the state doesn't have the capacity to deliver itself education? And it's not necessarily a straightforward answer, because the public schools are very weak in Liberia. On the other hand, bringing in some private providers from outside bring a lot of issues that you probably know and can guess, like who controls the education system, is it a good deal, how much does it cost, and so on and so forth. What's about labor conditions? So it brings a lot of challenges. And next slide. To try to address the challenges, what we are currently working on, and I say we, as together with Delphine, who's going to speak next, and 3 other organizations, Amnesty International, a Ugandan partner and a South African partner, we've put together a group of experts, so independent legal experts, who are reviewing all the existing jurisprudence and text on the right to education that exists, the law that exists. We're not making up new things. They're reviewing it and trying to consolidate it in one text that we call just guiding principles. So what you see at the top left is what the current outline of the guiding principles look like. We've been working for 3 years through a number of consultations. Some of you may have participated, and we know the final stage of this work where the guiding principles should be adopted in Abidjan next month, in February. After this text is adopted, we'll go through a whole process of implementation that could look like what the Safe School Declarations process was. So that's interesting learning we can take from there. Except that here, we're not necessarily going through a state adoption process. Because we are building on existing human rights obligations, so we consider states already have obligations, and we're only unpacking the existing obligations they have, so we don't have to adopt this, because we're normally already bound by it. And B, because this topic is so controversial and so political, we were worried that going through a state-led process would really weaken the text. So we're about to adopt this text, and then we have several years of implementation. We can discuss it afterwards if you want. My point is on substance, just to give you a couple of examples how this text could help reflect on private education in situation of emergency. I just gave you 2 examples of the guiding principles that you will find in the text. We now have we're coming close to a final draft. The text does recognize that states, there might be constraints on states. They may have little resources, or in a post-war, post-catastrophe context. But it does try to frame it. Say, okay, if a state is weak, there's a number of things you need to do. So with regards to public education, so that's the box on the right on your screen, Principle 35. It says states may be able to say, okay, I don't manage to deliver free primary and secondary education to all for now, but then the state must demonstrate it. And there's a number of criteria to demonstrate it. They exist in human rights law. That's what you can see in Principle 35. And I think that can be a helpful principle that help engage dialogue in states. Say, okay, maybe you have some constraint, but you need to demonstrate this. If you do, then let's think about it. Let's put together a plan to respond to those inabilities you have. So let's try to be a bit rational about it. Second example is the Principle 57, is at the bottom of your screen. Specifically the question of PPP. And again, looking back at Liberia. Again, what about if a state say, okay, I'm too weak, I'm unable to deliver education right now, but I have little money I'm willing to use it to pay some private providers to deliver education in our country, in our schools. What the guiding principles say, they don't say this is absolutely impossible, it can never happen. It says it should not generally be the rule, because public money should go to public education. There might be exceptional circumstances where this is justified. And this is the principle that is detailed in Principle 57, and there are substantive, procedural, and operational requirements. So all of it is detailed in the guiding principles. But again, and I can't go through all the details now. But the point is that there's a whole set of parameters that we can look at and assess the situation against in a much more rational way. I'll stop here because I think I'm way past my time.
Thank you, Sylvain, for a very interesting and I would say, sort of unique perspective on these issues related to private education and human rights. It is, at least personally, not something that I come across very often, but it's certainly something relevant for all of us working in the context of education emergencies. So we're 45 minutes into the webinar. We will conclude our presentations with Delphine Dorsey on the right to education, and then we'll move on to Q&A. We'll have a good at least 30 minutes or so. Delphine?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So what I'm going to present now is the work the Right to Education initiative has done in Ukraine in monitoring education under attack for advocacy, working with a journalist, a photographer, and a video journalist. So I'm going to tell you why we did that, for what purpose, and how we did it, and what's the advocacy plan next. So how this project came up is because this photographer, where you can see I put on the slide his website, is a Spanish photographer, Diego Ibera Sanchez, who have done already some work on education under attack. So he's a journalist, a photographer, going on conflict and taking pictures on different things, but he's super interesting about education. So he documented, for instance, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and other countries. And some of his pictures have been published, in many newspapers, and UNESCO as well have published some of his work. So he came to us and he said, look, I'm documenting some situation of education under attack, and I would like to collaborate with human rights organization and your organization as you work on the right to education. So for us was very interesting because at the same time, what we do at RTE, part of all our work, is developing tools to monitor the right to education. So not only in emergency, but in different contexts. And we have developed online monitoring tool explaining step by step how to monitor the right to education using some human rights indicators. So how we can use the law for better advocacy and referring to states' obligation. And so we had this in mind, like we want to do some pilot project to work with different actors in monitoring the right to education, always for advocacy and accountability. And to test and review our indicators. So when he came to us, he said, like, yes, let's try to do something together. Even is not a traditional actor, because normally we used to work with other education organization or human rights organization, and this he was a journalist, interesting in the topic, with some backgrounds on human rights, but not an expert. And so we decided to work with him to see how this can work and what we can learn from this project. And we chose Ukraine. So it was interesting in going in Ukraine and other countries in Syria, and we decided to go to Ukraine after doing some background research. And at that time, so this was back to end of 2017. The analysis was like, we know about the context and the conflict since 2014, more or less. There are some documentation by the education cluster about the attack and the school, the damage on school. The latest report at that time was from Human Rights Watch, who did an analysis of the situation. But talking with the partners, especially the education cluster and Human Rights Watch in Ukraine, it appeared like it was not so much updated information from a human rights perspective. It was information documenting the attack, but not an analysis, a more in-depth analysis. And also, we were not talking so much about Ukraine, which is still the case. And at the same time, it was some advocacy already at national level to document for the endorsement, of the Safe School Declaration. So Ukraine have not endorsed yet the Safe School Declaration. There are a lot of discussion for that, but it was not done yet. And so discussing with our partners there, we thought like maybe doing some work and having some picture and videos can support in a way the adoption of the Safe School Declaration in some instance. So this was the idea. And so we decided to go through the project really with this in mind. So to complement the information, we had already, and we know a bit, but go a bit deeper and see if we can get more information, especially from the, so I don't know if you know, but in Ukraine, the conflict make a division in the states between the government side and the rebel side, non-governmental forces. And there is this conflict line when there are some attacks. And most of the information comes from the Ukraine government side, but it's not so easy to go to the other part and to cross the line. And actually, what was interesting to work with Diego and then Ricardo, the video journalist who went there as well, was to cross the line and also to see what's happened in the other side, and to see if we can collect additional information from what we know, if the situation has changed from the latest report we had, in view of raising awareness about the situation in the country, to contribute to the advocacy work towards the adoption of the Safe School Declaration, and in the meantime to see through this pilot project how we can refine our list of indicators and the way to monitor in this particular situation, because it's very challenging to monitor in education under attack, and actually it's what we realized doing this project. And also beyond Ukraine, like how we can raise awareness about education under attack in other countries. So, I mean, this was the aim of the project, and we really do this in close collaboration. So it was not just us at RT doing this project and working with the photographer, but really to make the connection with the partner on the field, so the education cluster, Human Rights Watch, and other organizations we've been talking to assess what, because all the aim was to really complement and to support the ongoing work and advocacy. And what we've done, so assessing that with them, so Diego and Ricardo, they went to the conflict line and to the non-government part of Ukraine, collecting some data, and to guide them, having this human rights lens, because they are not experts, we provided them with some guidance of the type of information we would need from a human rights perspective to do advocacy. So, of course, it was mostly visual data. Even through the videos, they did also interview, and they collected information more qualitative about, for instance, because with the video you can document maybe the attack on the school, you can see if there are military use of the school, you can see if the playground is destroyed, but through the videos and the interview we get a sense as well of the stress on the kids, of the difficulty maybe to access school because of the danger on the way to school, or because of the stress, or do they get support from the state for the one who cannot get to school, and other issue who was actually not directly, who was indirect, like maybe the grandmother need to cross the line and go to another place to get the pension for the retirement, and at that time no one can take care of the school, of the kids, and bring them to school, and this raised indirect issues. So they came back with 38 pictures on both sides, because really the idea was to be as neutral as possible and not to look at one issue, and some videos. And so the project is ongoing at the moment. It's mean like, I mean, we have collected of the data, but it's not published yet. We are now doing a bit of narrative analysis of the situation and linking that to the human rights state's obligation. But the plan is now to make use of these videos and photography for advocacy to be used by the partner at national level, and link that as well with the report to the UN committees. So these have been mentioned both by Peter and Sylvain. Ukraine is going to be revised both by the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And already some organizations from Ukraine have submitted some information regarding education under attack. And we are going to see how the photography and the interview can be used as well as testimonies to complement the information already there. So this is the plan. We've been looking as well as maybe doing some events using the photography to attract people and have discussion around education under attack, around the Safe School Declaration, beyond just Ukraine, but this is still under planning. So in brief is where we are at, and we are actually at the moment looking at what we can learn from all this process and how we can also advise and direct others who want to do this type of work, working with non-traditional partners and using videos and photographies.
Thank you, Delphine. Very, very interesting as well, and certainly very unique, especially considering that media, is not always sort of a traditional ally of those of us doing education emergencies, but they can certainly are. They can certainly be. So we are. We're starting now. We're opening the floor for questions, discussions, and comments. If you have any of those, if you want to share with other participants an example of some of your work very briefly, so that we make sure that we hear from everybody and we have a chance to hear from the questions and answers from the presenters. Please either raise your hand on WebEx. You do that by finding your name on the participant list on WebEx and raising your hand, and I will call your name. Or you can also post or type your question or comment in the chat box at the bottom of the list. So while all of you prepare your questions, I actually want to go back to Delphine and ask her a question. I have my set of questions for the participants. So I will take the opportunity that I'm moderating to ask one question, and going back to the point that journalists and media are sort of non-traditional partners, and even though this project is sort of at that piloting phase, I would like Delphine to ask you for some of the key takeaways and lessons learned from the experience so far. I think many of us would benefit to think about broadly as to who our partners are in this field.
Yes. So what was interesting through this project and actually working with people we are not used to is they don't have the same approach as us, and this has been super interesting to learn. Even me, I'm into photography as well, and I have a lot of photographer friends. Working with them actually is a challenge and not only the photographer but the journalist as well, because they work on a very fast path. They go there and they want the things to be published, and and us as civil society organization, we need more time, because we need to consult, especially on a very sensitive issue as this can be in emergency context, especially in context, and on high political issue as Ukraine can be. You cannot just go there and make some publication and make a summary of what happened there. You need to consult with the organization on the ground. You need to make sure like any picture you are going to publish is not going to affect anyone. And this takes time. As you know, we all have our organization of work and time. And this we realized like this was not so clear at the beginning of the project. Like we were so enthusiastic, the two of us, like the RT and the photographer, of doing the project. But then we had to adjust a bit our way of working and explain them like we need time, and also because there are things we may not be able to publish even, just because this can impact the work on our partner on the ground. So this was something to learn. On the other side, it was amazing how they can mobilize very fast, how they can access place no one can go. They've been able to cross the line like that. I mean, and it has been a struggle because on the checkpoints they've been asked on the first travel to be checked about their camera and everything, but they managed to go through it. I mean, and defy the checkpoints and the police there, which maybe an organization as us we would have never done because of the relationship we have as well with the states. And it was the same what UNICEF and the education cluster told us. Like, there was super interesting about the material and the information collected to use it as a reference, but they was not in a position themselves to use it because of the relationship with the state and how they work. So I think in that way is quite interesting on how we can work with partners, and especially that one who are non-traditional, who may have another way of working, maybe not taking into account always all the parameters and going faster, but that can bring information or manage to go to place where we are not able to go. And I think they learn as well, because all the information we share with them and the guidance we give them about how to document what type of information is going to be useful for us for advocacy and to make the steps accountable, strengthen their own work as well. So even if at some point they don't work directly with us and they maybe just document some information and publish in the, I don't know, the New York Times or any other places, they can bring this lens as well. So even beyond just doing a joint project with them, this also, what we learn is how important it is to work with this type of person, to teach them about what we need to advocate, what is our direction for them to serve this purpose, and not doing just their own way. I mean, when they are willing to support. So, yeah, in brief, because I could talk again for hours, so I should stop, I think, now.
Okay. Well, thank you. And Delphine, you reminded me, given the type of work that you're doing with media, you reminded me of what you mentioned about, being conflict sensitive in our approaches, right? We want to make sure that these type of efforts and their interaction with conflict is to minimize it and to mitigate it, and not to, be mindful of doing no harm. There's a whole training on conflict sensitive education on the INEE website if you're interested, but very relevant. So we have Jasmina Milovanovic asking a question and sort of maybe breaking even a partnership there, and I'm going to read it. She says, I have a question for the Right to Education. Have they considered working in a coalition with other organizations apart from Human Rights Watch? There are some organizations like Save the Children who are working on the Safe School Declaration, and their work on photography could be useful in some joint advocacy on the issue. Are you planning some exhibition on the issue of the Safe School Declaration, which could coincide with some of the key dates in the 2019 policy calendar? And Delphine, feel free to respond to that briefly, and then maybe even Dia, you may have some thoughts as well, as it involves the Safe School Declaration.
Yes, so just in brief, we don't just work with Human Rights Watch. Actually, we work with the cluster, and so this includes Save the Children, UNICEF, and other organizations. But mainly in Ukraine, we've been talking with Save the Children as well, and Dia and others about the Safe School Declaration. And yes, one of our aim is to use this photography around the key events with others, because I mean, this is clear, like we can move things forward when we work collaboratively and together. So this work is to serve the work already done by so many amazing people, and happy to discuss with Yasmina and Dia and others on what's the best event, how we can join work together, including bringing other photography. And one of our ideas as well is to organize maybe a roundtable or a discussion with some actors involved in this area and to discuss this way of working and how best we can monitor in this sensitive context, because there are many parameters to take into account, either to collect the information or to release the information. So yes, a lot of work to do actually now after this pilot project.
Great. And thank you for clarifying who some of your other partners are and working with the education cluster, which is a very important partner. Dia, do you have any thoughts on Jasmina's question, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I mean, I think the work that they're doing is absolutely fascinating, and the coalition would be very interested in learning more about it and partnering in terms of disseminating the information from it. Of course, there's a phase in May, which is a Safe Schools Declaration, and that might also be a venue in which this could be presented or incorporated into a presentation. So yeah, no, I'd be very excited to speak offline in some more detail about how we can collaborate.
Great. And Dia, I was able to hear you, but I know some couldn't very well. So you can just repeat the last couple of sentences and probably get closer to the microphone. I think there's some noise in the background as well.
No, I was just saying that it would be, we're very eager to collaborate on this. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to work together and look at other countries where they might be able to do something similar. So I was suggesting that we have further conversations about it.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. I think it's fascinating when we have this type of learning events, but also they lead to something else, which is partnerships and collaboration. So that's great. And feel free to we'll put your email address, if that's okay with you, on the text box, on the chat box, so that if others want to reach out to you in terms of partnership, they can certainly do it. We have a question from Ricardo Castro to Sylvain. What improvements have you had with the application of the policies in private schools, especially compared with those of the public sector?
Hi, I think there's some mic open. Okay. I hope you can hear me now. I don't know whether you're referring to the case of Haiti or other schools. But I can reflect in general. We worked in about 20 countries doing similar processes. And it's very, any advocacy work is very hard to measure the impact. There's a risk of over-attributing, so maybe changes are not thanks to you, or under-attributing. There might be things that, something bad that did not happen thanks to you, but you don't know because it did not happen. So it's very hard to measure. But if I reflect on our work on Bridge International Academies in general, I don't know if everyone knows about it. It's a chain of low-fee private school, American low-fee private schools, extremely problematic, and operates in 5 countries, including Liberia. Although in all the countries they operate independently in Liberia within PPP. What we've seen in the last 2 years is massive improvement in the standards used by these schools. I mean, they're still very far from anything acceptable, but we have seen they employ way more qualified teachers now. They try to improve, for instance, some facilities like toilets. So having had a lot of advocacy, including using some of the techniques I shared, has definitely helped improve some schools. Now, how does it compare to public education? That's a good question. And there's kind of 2 tracks advocacy that needs to be going together. Is one, better regulate private school and progressively close those that don't meet minimum standards, and at the same time improve public education. And the improving public education is largely linked to the amount of resources put in it, and that takes time. I don't know if I can tell in any country it works in. There's been massive improvement in public education yet, but there's been some more. For instance, Kenya just declared they would make a massive commitment to funding education. They said I think 30% of their budget. I don't know whether it's thanks to us, so I don't want to over-attribute, but there's been some commitment to better fund education, which is due to many, many parameters, not just us, like the SDGs. And that will take some time to translate into practice, hopefully. But overall, it's just very hard to measure advocacy impact, so I don't want to exaggerate it.
Thank you, Sylvain. You were very concrete and to the point. We have another question from Jehan Bawazir. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly. Jehan is asking, and I guess this question goes to Dia, in terms of the applied Safe School Declaration, how do you work with non-state actors who are part of the school attack? And you alluded to a little bit of that, but I think certainly you can expand. I know some of your plans or intentions to work and expand the sort of definition of attack and include non-state actors such as gangs in Central America, which is our case in my particular case. So Dia, if you can expand a little more about that question of non-school actors, non-state actors.
Yes, of course. So the Safe Schools Declaration is something that is signed by states. So the commitments within there are commitments that the states are held to, not non-state armed groups. However, the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use are intended to be used both by the military, state military, as well as non-state armed groups. But having said that, the way we work with non-state armed groups is mainly through an organization called Geneva Call, whose whole mission is to work with non-state armed groups in applying international human rights law and humanitarian law standards. So they have a set of what they call deeds of commitment, one of which is on children in armed conflict, and one of the commitments within there is that non-state armed groups sign on to is that they will not use schools for military purposes. So we are working with the non-state armed groups directly through Geneva Call, and Geneva Call in fact has workshops with non-state armed groups where they go through the different aspects of the deeds of commitment, and our partners and ourselves have presented at these workshops on the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines, and worked with them on really highlighting how important it is to not use schools for military purposes. And a question we often get is, well, what's really the point of working with non-state armed groups? They're not going to be rational and want to take any steps to protect education. But when there are many non-state armed groups who want, of course, to be the next government, and so they're very concerned about what the community and what the population thinks of them, and they want to show that they're meeting the needs of the population, especially point out how the government is not. And so many are motivated to take actions to better protect education, and it's those non-state armed groups that Geneva Call usually works with. So that's primarily how we do it. We also we document both cases, attacks by governments as well as attacks by schools. Part of the reason why it's a little difficult for us to work with the non-state armed groups directly is because we work with governments as well, and sometimes the governments feel that we're legitimizing the non-state armed group if we include them in sort of a workshop or something together. So that's the reason why we've chosen to really do this through Geneva Call, and of course Geneva Call has much better contacts with these non-state armed groups as well.
Great. Sorry, I had muted my phone. Thank you, Dia, and I'm sure you can expand much more. But thank you for being cognizant of the time. We have there's been some interesting discussions on the chat box. Again, sort of sharing information if related to potential partnerships between organizations. That's great to hear or to read. A question from World Vision, we don't know who exactly in World Vision or where, but somebody in World Vision asking the question about how is advocacy progressing with countries who have not signed to protect schools from attack, or I guess this means that they have not signed the declaration. For example, Syria. What are the reasons for states not to sign? So I guess that question goes to you, Dee, as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the reason why states usually don't sign on to is because they argue that that it's an issue of national security, and that they don't want any third party coming in and telling them how they should be running their national security. So the controversial element within the Safe Schools Declaration is always the component on implementing the guidelines on military use of schools. That's usually the sticking point. Whenever we do advocacy, we usually do it with the Foreign Ministry, the Ministries of Education, and then the Department of Defense and the Armed Forces themselves. And the Ministries of Defense of Education are usually on our side and supportive and serve as advocates with us with their own government often. But it's always the Ministries of Defense and the Armed Forces themselves that are opposed to it, because they feel that this is not a sphere that anyone should be limiting their purview on. Some argue that it's already this issue is already dealt with through international humanitarian law and human rights law, and that they don't need an additional set of guidelines to govern their behavior. To which we answer that, well, what these guidelines do is they provide more sort of concrete guidance to armed forces and non-state armed groups on what they can do in the arena of war. So we're not trying to replace humanitarian law or human rights law. We're sort of providing more clear-cut guidance on how to implement it, and also the guidelines do go a step beyond what international humanitarian law requires. And so this is there for countries that want to take that additional step and better protect education. So those are the main reasons why the states don't sign on. Given that there's so many that have now signed on, it becomes a little embarrassing for many states to not be included. They then have to answer why have they decided not to participate when all these other countries seem to think that it's possible to do so without compromising their security. So the more countries that come on, the more difficult it becomes for states to make that argument. So I think for some countries, they just are less prone or susceptible to criticism by other states. Syria clearly is one of those. So I think, again, the more that sign on, again, the more difficult it becomes for others to lag behind. Yeah.
Thank you, and I think that's a good. I'll make a plug for to say that it's not just up to the global coalition to sort of advocate for states and governments to sign the declaration, but all of us in this field. There's something we can do and advocate for host governments or the countries where we work. If they have not signed the declaration, there is an opportunity there to do some advocacy. So that is important. And the question was asked by, of course, my good friends Marco and Mark. What a duo. Oh my God. Thank you guys for participating. Sylvain is sharing some links on how to, using human rights mechanisms, either UN or others. There's a link on the text box. He's also sharing a link to the guiding principles on private actors in education. You can look at the adoption conference on next month. So there's if you're interested, there's all those links that Sylvain is posting on the text box. I want to actually go back and take the opportunity before we close. We have about 10 to 12 minutes. But before we close, I'm going back to INEE and ask a question to Peter as sort of the INEE Advocacy Working Group Coordinator, and the role of INEE does INEE get involved in or lead any advocacy related to treaty bodies or coordinating shadow reports? Can you expand a little more on what are the kinds of things that INEE does, using human rights approaches to advocate for education emergencies? Peter?
Yes, thank you, Gustavo. Let me see. Actually, INEE doesn't get involved directly. For you, those of you who don't know, let me just explain that INEE is a network of 15,000 members, but especially of quite a lot of institutional members, both governments, UN organizations, universities, civil society organizations, both international NGOs, big ones like Save the Children, World Vision, Plan, or smaller ones working in perhaps one country or in a region. So we are, we're a very big tent of a lot of different actors, and hence we also need, to a certain extent, to be neutral. So we don't get involved directly in advocacy, such as submitting or coordinating a report, a shadow report to a UN mechanism, or however, we will hopefully when the guiding principles on private actors come out here next month, as Sylvain was talking about, we will be ready to sign up to it and endorse it. So in that sense, we can. But our major kind of advocacy effort is to coordinate and to bring people together, such as today, in a seminar like this, to share information, to make sure that people see these opportunities. We are not a human rights organization as such. In one sense, we all are, of course, because human rights is our concern and our objective. But we cannot offer legal advice in the same vein, perhaps, as Delphine and the Right to Education Project, or Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, or Dia from Global Coalition can do, or Sylvain. But we can coordinate, and but it's also important to keep that neutrality in a sense. So that's what we'll be doing. There's right now, many of you, of course, know there's the whole process around this SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on education. There's a process leading up to a meeting that will take place in New York this summer, called the High Level Political Forum, and where countries will be examined, a bit like the UN treaty bodies, but not legally binding. And there we are hoping to work with national coalition through the Global Coalition for Education in support of countries as well as civil society to raise some pertinent questions on education in emergencies, for example, to raise that issue within the wider development reporting business. So there we have a role to play. And again, but we are a lot of people. It's a very big tent, so we have different opportunities to do it, also kind of a bit under the radar, and sometimes we do it above the radar with our full name and our full branding onto it. So I don't know if that answers some of your questions, Gustavo.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it is important to clarify and remind people, especially for those of you in participating who are not necessarily that familiar with INEE. You can always sign up to be a member, and then there's opportunities every 2 years or so when organizations can apply to be an active, to be an active working group member. So stay tuned. Just a comment to Sylvain. It seems that one of the links is not working. As Sam mentioned, Sylvain, the link leads nowhere. Can you please resend it? So if you can just try again, and that may be the link of the guiding principles. So if you want to reshare it, that'll be great. Also, Delphine is sharing the guiding principles as well on the posted on the Right to Education website. Thank you, Delphine, for that. And we have about 5 minutes, and what I thought we could do is, I know some people had to leave, but we still have quite a few participants. And I would like to ask each of the participants to give sort of a 30-second final remark. If you have something else you wanted to say, you haven't been able to share it, have 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but no more than that, to share. If you want to pass, that's completely fine, and we can always end a few minutes earlier. But so if you have anything else to add, please do so. And I'll start with Pete. We'll go in the same order. So Peter, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Any resource, any comment, anything that you may want to share?
Thank you, Gustavo. I won't take a minute because I just have the opportunity to talk right now, but I'll just encourage you to go to INEE's website. From there, you will see links to all our member organizations and their websites, such as GCPE, as the Right to Education, and many others. But also our website is extremely rich. It's being revamped at the moment, so it'll be easier to navigate in a month or two. But we have a lot of resources. Gustavo was referring before to the conflict-sensitive education pack, which is, of course, a central element in bringing about the understanding of how education and bad education sometimes can impact on conflict. We have the minimum standards on education emergencies, which is our flagship publication, and which is informing a lot of other projects and initiatives going around, and is a handbook for implementing right to education in emergencies. And just like Sylvain was talking about, it is based on existing law. So we're not going to get endorsements or ratifications like the Safe School Declaration for the minimum standards, because it's already there. It is an exemplification or an elaboration and a specification with regards to right to education of what is already there, what is already the obligation of the state and of the international community. So please do go and have a look on our website for the richness of resources, and become a member of INEE and contribute to that community of practice through blogs. We want to learn about your work, and please, there's an ample opportunity and platform to share your work in the INEE community.
Great, thank you for the plug, Peter. Dia, is there anything else you want to share in 1 minute?
Yes, I just want to maybe say a few words about how the Safe Schools Declaration can be a tool for your advocacy as well. First of all, it sort of encompasses all the recommendations that we as a coalition have sort of gathered together in terms of protecting education from attack in a holistic manner. And as a result, it covers, of course, the military use of schools, but also monitoring and reporting, prosecution for perpetrators, assistance to victims, which includes psychosocial support. It also includes planning and continuation of education during conflict. So when countries have signed on to the declaration, they are obviously looking for a way to show that they're actually doing something on these different commitments. And so sometimes when you present your advocacy, when you're asking them to do something on a particular issue, you can frame it as something that is incorporated into the commitments within the Safe Schools Declaration, and so then they have more of an imperative and a responsibility to implement it, because they've actually made a commitment to do something on it. So just pointing that out is something you might want to think about. Someone from a government came to me and asked about, they want to do stuff on psychosocial support, but they didn't really see that in the Safe Schools Declaration. And I said, well, look, it's under this component of assistance to victims. And that was really exciting for that person, because then they could go back to their superiors and say, well, this is a way of implementing the Safe Schools Declaration, and then there's more support for it because and funding for it, because governments have already made that commitment. So I'll leave it on that.
Great, thank you so much, Dia. There's an interesting comment from our friends World Vision about human rights-based advocacy. It's great to do it, but they should be translating advocating for human rights-based programming rather than needs-based programming. Certainly, maybe a topic for discussion. We won't have time, but thank you for the comment. And I just want to ask Sylvain, is there anything else? Oh, just one more thing to add is there will be a YouTube video of this webinar, so stay tuned for that. And we'll look into the presentations, but not the video will be available. Sylvain, do you have anything else to add in like 30 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, just I shared something, but just I want really to encourage everyone to consider using human rights tools and mechanisms. I know it's not commonly used in emergency settings because you're dealing with emergency. But as Peter, I really like the slide where Peter said human rights do not stop an emergency context, and it'd be good to put that. It's also our role to put that into practice. So we need to also defend the rights in emergency context in addition to supporting the immediate needs. And I know it's not easy, but where possible, I would really encourage it. And we, as I put in the text, we're available to help anyone who has questions. And I also wanted to flag that the guiding principles will be adopted next month, and afterwards there'll be a whole process of implementation. We'll translate the tool, the guiding principles, into easier to use tools, and it will be open for endorsement by civil society organizations, including all of you here. So there's really a whole process ongoing where everyone will have a chance to engage, and I'm very happy to talk to anyone who's interested.
Thank you so much, Sylvain. And Delphine, we'll close with you.
Yes, I think I would say, like, we know using human rights is sometimes a challenge, and advocating in terms of in context of emergency, it's even more challenging, also because of all the political challenge. But this is actually a way where we can go and be as neutral as possible using state obligation and reminding them about what they have to do. And as Sylvain said, like, emergency is not like to solve the situation right now. There are things to put in place, even right now in the emergency context, to build the steps for the future, including in terms of the type of education we are going to deliver and what we put in place, either by the states or by the institution and organization who supplement temporarily the states. And we all have responsibility in that. And we've been raising the issue of private actors. And this is a massive issue in terms of emergency context, because it's an emergency, because we see the urgency. And sometimes we take decisions without thinking in the future. And I think it's important to have this human rights lens in mind on how we can ensure the right to education at any time, even in emergency context, as much as we can. And it's our role to do this monitoring, to make the states accountable or other governmental institutions to move on. And experience shows that it's possible, even in Ukraine, where things seem super challenging and no one wants to talk about Ukraine because it's so high political. There are ways and paths to go there, and to raise awareness in different places, including to UN committee or other places.
Great, thank you. What a great way to close this webinar with Delphine's remarks. We're over a couple of minutes now. Thank you, everybody, for joining and for staying these last couple of minutes extra. That was a bonus. Stay tuned for the YouTube video and other resources related to this topic. And also stay tuned for another webinar, which will be the third in a series of webinars on issues related to advocacy for education emergencies. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the participants, all the presenters, for your hard work in this field, and certainly for sharing your insights today. We'll close now, and thank you, everybody, again.